folks, it's a genuine honour, and I mean that, to be asked to speak here at Leicester Secular Society. And you may not know, but I was until May a councillor in Bosworth for the Liberal Democrats, dare I mention. And I can tell you that after being booted out of office by the electorate in May, it's nice to be asked to speak anywhere, quite honestly. I was, as I say, a borough councillor in Bosworth for 4 years. And no longer being a councillor, you have to get used to some people treating you maybe a little bit differently than they did before. The phone not ringing quite so often, the invites drying up, people not hanging off your every word. So it's nice to have somewhat of a captive audience here tonight at the Secular Hall. Just before I get into the issue at hand, I'm always told that you should have some attempt at humour at the start of a speech, so here goes. I'm reminded of one of my favourite political anecdotes, and it's a story of the former US President Calvin Coolidge, who served in the White House from 1923 to 1929. And although a gifted public speaker in public settings, he was very quiet in private. Said very little at all in private, did this President of the United States. And he earned the nickname Silent Cal. And on one occasion, hosting a dinner at the White House, and him having said nothing at all evening, the wife of a senator leaned over to him and said, "Mr. President, I bet my husband $20 I can get you to say 3 words." To which he replied, "You lose." Well, saying very little may be good advice in politics, and maybe that would have helped me out, but in advocacy and campaigning, words are needed, as is passion, commitment, dedication, and an ability to keep fighting even when you think a cause seems hopeless. And I'm proud this evening to speak on the next steps for LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender equality, and to advocate for practical, principled and progressive change. But before we look forward, it is right to momentarily look back and to reflect on how far in a relatively short time we've come so far in terms of increased rights, visibility and confidence in, with and for the LGBT communities, here in Leicester and Leicestershire and across the country. Same-sex marriage in England, Scotland and Wales, though sadly not yet in Northern Ireland, and we mustn't forget our LGBT friends in Northern Ireland who are still not equal under the law, being the most visible and tangible expression of that change. And what a year 2015 has been so far, with the Republic of Ireland via a popular mandate in a referendum, and the United States of America via the decision of its federal Supreme Court, both seeing same-sex marriage legalised. And whatever we think of either of those means, and I have to say I'm not a general fan of equality being decided by popular mandate, but they had to do that in Ireland to change their constitution. So whatever we think of the means, it's the end that matters. Now, if there's one downside to all of these steps forward in terms of equality, it's that some people will think, maybe some people here, that all the battles have been won, that the need for campaigning is over, that there's no fight left to be had. But of course, the reality is nothing could be further from the truth. So what are the next steps towards LGBT equality? Well, this is my view, and other LGBT folks may have a different set of priorities, but this is what I think the next steps towards equality are. There's an urgent need to tackle homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying in our schools. In its most recent school report, the LGB and Now Team, thank goodness, charity Stonewall, found that homophobic bullying continues to be widespread in Britain's schools. More than half, 55% of lesbian, gay and bisexual pupils have experienced direct bullying. It found the use of homophobic language is endemic in our schools, with almost all, 99% of gay young people hearing phrases such as "that's so gay" or "you're so gay," and not meant in a positive way, I can assure you, in school. And 96% of gay pupils hearing homophobic language. Astonishingly, 3 in 5 gay pupils who experience homophobic bullying say that the teachers who witness it never intervene. Only half of gay pupils report that their school says homophobic bullying is wrong. Let me just repeat that. Only half of gay pupils say that their school says, as policy, that homophobic bullying is wrong. And in faith schools, you might not be surprised to hear that it's even fewer, just 37%. As the report also finds, homophobic bullying has a profoundly damaging impact on young people's school experience. 1 in 3 gay pupils experiencing bullying change their future educational plans because of it, and 3 in 5 say it impacts directly on their schoolwork. Gay people who are bullied are at a higher risk of suicide, self-harm and depression. 2 in 5 have attempted or thought about taking their own life directly because of the bullying, and the same number say they deliberately self-harm directly because of the bullying. So a big step that needs to be taken is action to stamp out bullying because people are, or even are perceived to be, LGBT or T. We need age-appropriate recognition of what it means to be LGBT in our schools, from primary schools upwards, and there's lots of fantastic resources that schools can tap into these days. There's so much. One person doing fantastic and inspiring work on this agenda, who I met at a meeting in Parliament last year, is a gentleman called Sean Delenti, who's the only openly gay deputy head teacher, openly gay, I hate that phrase, but that's the phrase that we use, of a South London primary school. He's the founder of an organisation called Inclusion for All. And he says this: I devised Inclusion for All after 15 years of working in UK schools, during which time I witnessed school staff and school governors at every level unable or unwilling to proactively tackle homophobic bullying. Many wonderful school staff lacked the training to support children who were obviously suffering, some of whom were questioning their identity, and many of whom did not conform to established gender stereotypes. He goes on, I saw some school leaders ignoring homophobic bullying, and I saw some teachers using and condoning homophobic and transphobic language. I saw some gay teachers living in fear of being outed, living inauthentic lives, and I saw brave out gay teachers being openly bullied by parents, pupils, and even their colleagues with no support. He says, as a school leader, my core purpose must be to educate and to ensure the safety and well-being of all pupils in my care. Schools that fail to tackle all forms of prejudice-related bullying, for whatever reason, are therefore, in my humble opinion, failing their pupils. It is important to note, he says, that homophobic and other prejudice-related bullying and language can potentially affect all pupils in school, not just those who may be perceived as different or those who may be questioning their identity. As a school leader, he says it would be unthinkable and illegal of me to ignore bullying based on race, religion, gender or disability. Allowing homophobic, biphobic or transphobic bullying to go on unchallenged in schools is no different. Similarly, as a school leader, he said, if I am unable to support my own staff to be authentic in the workplace, how can I hope to provide an inclusive and representative community in which LGBTQI children or those with LGBTQI friends or family can live and learn to the best of their ability? And he ends with, I do not class myself as an overtly political individual, nor do I consider myself to be a campaigner or activist. My work was motivated by the needs of pupils in my care, and my moral purpose remains to put the needs of children first. One shouldn't have to be an activist or campaigner to put the safety and well-being of all children first. Sean Delenti, a real hero to me and to many. Sticking with education, and I think this is another step we need personal, social, health and economic education, PSHE, to be a statutory requirement for all state-funded schools. Why? Well, as the British Humanist Association, of which I'm a member and probably not the only one here, says, because PSHE is not a statutory subject, so-called faith schools are free to teach it from a religious perspective. We, they say, are particularly concerned that the sex and relationships component, if they are taught at all, may be taught in ways that are homophobic, gender discriminatory, or that otherwise violate principles of human rights, or are otherwise inadequate, or fail to deliver a broad relationships education. I'm pleased to say there is movement on this, with the Green MP Caroline Lucas attempting to steer a bill through Parliament at present. And in a briefing note for MPs prepared by her office, it states, the current position is untenable. Ofsted's most recent PSHE report, entitled Not Yet Good Enough, found that teaching of it required improvement in 40% of schools. Lack of statutory status means the training and support just isn't there. On SRE, sex and relationships education, the last statutory SRE guidelines were produced 14 years ago. Caroline Lucas's bill, which very sadly, due to lack of parliamentary time and government support, is unlikely to make it onto the statute books, is being used as a high-profile way of raising the agenda of the issue. It has widespread support, including from Stonewall, teachers, trade unions, parents, the UK Youth Parliament, and others. And the briefing makes special mention of young LGBT people, stating, homophobic language and bullying remains common in schools, as we've heard. LGBT young people need information and support to help them deal with intimidation and isolation. So I very much hope that this bill receives as much support as possible, so the government recognise the parliamentary and public support for such a move and will in future give government support and time for it. And I would encourage you here to write to your MP, encouraging them to back this bill ahead of its second reading in October. Staying with the experiences of LGBT young people, and earlier this month, the Albert Kennedy Trust, which supports young LGBT 16 to 25-year-olds who are made homeless or living in a hostile environment, marked 25 years of its existence and said there was much still to do. It says, despite legislation which has sought to establish a fairer and more equal society, we live in a time where, and I quote, young people are facing greater challenges than ever before, in particular around homelessness and debt. At the Trust, the number of bed nights they provided to young people, young LGBT people who found themselves chucked out of home, most often than not after coming out to their parents, has risen from 3,000 to almost 8,000 in 12 months. And they're predicting a further 50% rise this year. In 2013, AKT opened the UK's first emergency accommodation exclusively for LGBT young people fleeing violence or homelessness. And next month, they're releasing findings from the first national survey of LGBT youth homelessness. And they say they'll use this information, and I quote, not only to inform our own growth nationally as an organisation, to meet real need, but also to inform the decisions of ministers, local government and housing providers. Continuing, we hope to inform decisions around welfare and housing benefits to the under-25s, whilst providing a clear case for the provision of more safe and affordable housing for young people facing abuse and rejection. And without really wanting to be too party political about it, I do have to ask how many young LGBT people are suffering as a result of this government's, I would argue, apparent war on young people, like some of the measures announced in the recent budget. Tim Sigsworth, CEO of the Albert Kennedy Trust, says, my hope for the next 25 years is that AKT will no longer be needed, because society has reached a level of equality and fairness where young people are accepted by their families and mainstream provision truly recognises and meets their needs. Statistics, of course, are important, but it's human stories, isn't it, that really resonate. Like that of John, a young gay man from Manchester who fled his homophobic father's attacks after coming out to his parents. Subsequently finding himself staying in a number of far from safe places, he got in contact with AKT, who supported him in making a housing application for his own accommodation and helped him get mental health crisis intervention for his depression. He says, the past 6 months have probably been the worst of my life for various reasons. And for me, there was no light at the end of the tunnel. That was until I met Glenda and everyone at the AKT. They shaped and guided me towards the light, he says. The support they provided, emotional and tangible, made life a lot easier while I was trying to get my head around and cope with the situation. Quite simply, without the help from the AKT, I don't think I would still be here to write this now. They've supported me through one of the biggest changes of my life, he said. I think for all LGBT young people, it's the fear of the reactions of those we love most to our coming out that often makes it such a nerve-wracking and stressful thing to do. And I can tell you that, I've known that I was gay since I was about 14 or 15, but didn't come out until my 31st birthday when I told all of my family on the same day. It's quite a day, I can tell you. Just over 4 years ago. And thankfully my parents and family were great about it, all of them. Most of them said, yes, we've known that for years, Matthew. But clearly, in many cases, that's not the case. And a big step forward for LGBT equality would be for government, local and national, to do more to help LGBT young people who find themselves homeless and in crisis after coming out to their families. One of the biggest areas we need significant steps forward on, in my view, is on tackling inequalities for trans people. A 2009 report, the Trans Research Review for the Equality and Human Rights Commission, stated in its introduction that it's only in the last decade that trans people have been accorded rights and given protection in law from discrimination. It goes on, there is growing recognition of the discrimination, inequalities and social exclusion that trans people face by policymakers and the public. Much of the progress achieved in the last decade can be attributed to successful campaigning by trans groups such as Press for Change. The Trans Review highlights the inequalities and high levels of discrimination trans people face, including attitudes towards trans people, housing, education, crime, economic status and employment, health and social care, media, leisure and sports, family life and relationships, community and citizenship. The lack of government and/or publicly collected data on trans people says, the review says, is virtually non-existent, no data at all collected by government. What existing evidence there is, collated mostly by trans groups themselves, suggests, says the review, that trans people experience and are badly affected by transphobia in a wide range of forms, including bullying and discriminatory treatment in schools, harassment and physical sex assaults and rejection from families, work colleagues and friends. A 2008 survey found that 62% of respondents had experienced transphobic harassment from strangers in public places who perceived them to be trans. While another report noted that 73% of respondents experienced comments, threatening behaviour, physical abuse, verbal abuse or sexual abuse while in public spaces. Tackling transphobia must be a priority. And I have to remind myself that even in the celebrations of equal marriage in England and Wales, it was all too easy to forget, if you weren't careful, that the new legislation wasn't actually as equal as LGBT campaigners would have liked. As a report in the New Statesman noted, the new law allows for trans people who are already married to gain gender recognition without having to get divorced, which is extremely welcome and long overdue. However, because there remains a distinction in the legislation between same-sex and opposite-sex marriages, the spouse must also consent. The trans person cannot gain gender recognition until either the spouse consents or they get divorced. And this is commonly known as the spousal veto. So there remains significant discrimination against trans people in the law that everyone celebrates as providing equality. And this must change. A significant step forward on the road to full LGBT equality was taken with the Equality Act 2010, which says public authorities must comply with the public sector equality duty, which aims to make sure that public authorities think about things like discrimination and the needs of people who are disadvantaged or suffer inequality when they make decisions about how they provide their services and implement their policies. If a public authority hasn't properly considered this, hasn't properly considered its public sector equality duty, you can challenge it in the courts. People who are protected under the Act have what's called protected characteristics, and they include gender reassignment and sexual orientation. It's worth noting that marriage and civil partnerships are also protected characteristics under the Equality Act, but it's not covered by the public sector equality duty. The Act and the duty are, of course, welcome, but I would suggest that we need to be doing more to ensure public bodies are living up to their duties under it, ensuring it's not just a tick box exercise, but that proper monitoring takes place of all public bodies. Another issue where action needs taking, and soon, is a reversal of the ban on men who have sex with men being able to donate blood. As a report on the Pink News website reported last month, this comes amid a critical lack of donors, that's the irony in it. At the moment, there's a 12-month deferral following sexual contact in England, Scotland and Wales, and a permanent ban, you might guess where, in Northern Ireland. Among those calling for a change is Peter Black, happens to be Welsh Assembly member for my party, the Liberal Democrats, who said, "National Blood Week has brought to our attention that the blood service needs 204,000 extra donors to meet demand. Given this huge demand," he says, "for blood donors, I completely fail to understand why the ban on men who have sex with men giving blood is in place. This ban not only turns away thousands of willing and healthy potential donors, but it also serves to reinforce negative stereotypes about gay and bisexual men. Straight people get HIV too," he says, "and all donated blood is tested for HIV and other diseases for precisely that reason." And he concluded by saying, "The sooner this unfair and discriminatory ban is lifted, the sooner our blood services can benefit from a greater supply of donated blood and more lives can be saved." Meanwhile, Dr. Sean Griffin, Executive Director of External Affairs at the Terence Higgins Trust, told Pink News, "It would seem that at a time when the NHS is facing a much publicised challenge because of a lack of blood donors, with figures plummeting 40% in the last decade, a wider review into all the current restrictions may be timely to help address this, including the deferral period for men who have sex with men, so that we have the most appropriate restrictions based on the best available evidence." I'm really proud to be a director of the Leicester LGBT Centre, although I don't speak on behalf of them tonight, I speak only on behalf of myself, which is a registered charity established to support LGBT people in Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. And the team there, my fellow board members, the staff team led by Paul Fitzgerald, and the volunteers do such an outstanding job in supporting our communities locally. As I say, I'm speaking independently of my role on the board at the centre today, but I did want to highlight an important piece of work that it's been involved in that recently made the news, looking at the issue of hate crime. And a news item on its website states, "Fear of how they will be treated is leading thousands of LGBT people to not report hate crimes. And as a result, perpetrators are evading justice. Evidence nationally suggests that around 35,000 cases of hate crime committed against people because of their sexuality or their perceived sexuality go unreported every year. The report from the University of Leicester's Centre for Hate Studies reveals that 88% of LGBT people had experienced some form of hate incident, leaving them with emotional and physical scars. Based on in-depth interviews here in Leicester and Leicestershire, the report also states that only 14% of LGB victims reported their most recent experience of hate crime to the police. Additional national evidence in the report shows that victims of transphobia can be targeted up to 50 times in a single year, although only 3 in 10 report the incidents. The publication of the report coincides with a major new campaign to raise awareness of LGBT hate crime by a partnership of 31 organisations funded by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, with the message of recognise it, report it. The campaign will empower LGBT people to stand up against hate crime through education and training, as well as establishing local partnerships. And Paul Roberts, Chief Executive of the LGBT Consortium, which is leading the partnership, said this: "LGBT communities are already working with the police to remove barriers to reporting and offer practical and emotional support. However, too often, LGBT people don't know they are experiencing hate crime, or they just shrug it off. Collectively, we are saying it's time to move on from this. Our message today," he says, "is to recognise hate crime when it happens, report it, and get support when you need it." This is, again, in my view, a vital part of the ongoing agenda towards LGBT equality. A lot of that is fairly domestic, isn't it? But to turn briefly to the international situation, and all too often that situation is bleak. As Amnesty International, with whom I'm a member and a campaigner with its LGBT network, reminded us in a posting this week, some of you may have received it, for millions of LGBT people in 2015, it said the world remains a very dangerous place. Such as in Russia, where a journalist, a female journalist as it happens, was found guilty of homosexual propaganda after setting up an online support group for LGBT teenagers in Russia. Or Bulgaria, where a 25-year-old man was murdered, a gang beating him to death, the reason they thought he was gay. That, for them, was justification enough. Or Nigeria, where just last year, its Senate passed a bill, and I quote, prohibits the public show of same-sex amorous relationships directly or indirectly. So no kissing your partner when out for a coffee there. And an astonishing fact is that 135 countries have no laws prohibiting discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation. So, as you can tell, both domestically and internationally, there is a lot of work to do to achieve full LGBT equality. And I'm not just saying this because I'm here, but I do believe actually that the values of secularists and humanists have a big part to play in helping this agenda on its way. I don't just say that because I'm one of your number as well. I'd like to end with 3 quotes. The first of which is from Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, who said, "We should all speak out. We should all speak out when someone is arrested or imprisoned because of who they love or how they look. This is one of the great neglected human rights challenges of our time." And 2 from Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long and bends towards justice. I hope in coming years we can continue our big steps towards justice to the betterment of LGBT plus people everywhere." Thanks very much.